A scruffy, thin stray dog named Max wandered into the bustling marketplace, his ribs faintly visible beneath his matted fur. His nose twitched as the rich aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, and sizzling street food filled the air. Hunger gnawed at his belly, urging him forward. He cautiously weaved through the crowd, sniffing at fallen scraps, hoping for a morsel of kindness from a passing stranger. But kindness was hard to come by. A vendor swatted at him with a broom. "Get out of here, mutt," he barked. A shopper recoiled. "Filthy animal," she muttered, stepping away as if his presence alone might dirty her expensive shoes. A child reached out, fascinated by the dog, but his mother yanked him back. "Don't touch that thing." Max hesitated, his tail wagging hesitantly, his eyes pleading. He had learned not to expect much, but he refused to give up. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What the hell is that stray doing here?" Officer Grant, a broad-shouldered, no-nonsense policeman, stood at the edge of the crowd. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the afternoon sun. He had been patrolling the marketplace, keeping an eye out for pickpockets and disturbances, but now his focus zeroed in on Max. The officer's face twisted in irritation. To him, stray dogs were pests, dirty, disease-ridden creatures that had no place in a civilized space. He had dealt with them before, chasing them out of alleyways, breaking up fights over scraps. This one was no different. Max met his gaze, ears flattening slightly. He didn't mean any harm. He just wanted food. But Officer Grant wasn't in the mood for sympathy. With a huff of frustration, he reached for the canister on his belt. Before anyone could react, he pulled out his pepper spray, aimed it at the dog, and pressed the nozzle. A sharp hiss filled the air. Max yelped, his body jerking back as the burning mist stung his eyes and nose. He let out a panicked whimper, pawing at his face, before scrambling away, weaving blindly through the crowd. His tail was tucked between his legs, his body shaking from both fear and pain. A gasp rippled through the marketplace. People stopped in their tracks. Some exchanged horrified looks, while others fumbled for their phones, quickly recording the scene. A woman let out a shocked, "Oh my God," while a young man in a hoodie muttered, "Did he really just do that?" A few bystanders turned their eyes to Officer Grant, their expressions shifting from surprise to disapproval. But the officer merely adjusted his belt, unfazed. "Damn strays," he muttered, shaking his head. "They don't belong here." Yet, as Max disappeared down the alley, whimpering and confused, a sense of unease settled over the crowd. Something about what they had just witnessed didn't sit right. And unknown to Officer Grant, the moment had already been captured on multiple cameras, ready to be shared with the world. Little did he know, he would soon regret his actions. Once a loyal companion to a man he thought loved him, Max had been cast out like trash, left to fend for himself and his newborns in the unforgiving winter. Snow clung to their fragile bodies as they huddled together, desperate for warmth. But no warmth came, only darkness. Then, in the distance, footsteps approached. Max stumbled through the marketplace, his vision blurred and his nose burning from the spray. He whimpered, pawing at his face, disoriented and frightened. Every step felt unsteady as he crashed into a crate of vegetables, sending tomatoes rolling across the pavement. His body ached, but worse than the physical pain was the confusion. Why had that man hurt him? Then, a voice rang out. "Max!" A tall, rugged man pushed through the growing crowd. His sharp brown eyes locked onto the struggling dog, and his heart clenched at the sight. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward him, his voice thick with urgency. Max perked up at the familiar sound, though he could barely see. His ears twitched, his body still trembling, but there was recognition in the way his tail gave a weak wag. Daniel dropped to his knees, his hands immediately moving to his dog's face. "Easy, buddy, I'm here," he murmured, his voice softer now. He cupped Max's head, trying to assess the damage. The poor dog flinched, his face still stinging, and Daniel's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed against Max's fur, and he could feel the tension in his body, the rapid, frightened breaths. He had been searching for Max for weeks, ever since his beloved dog had gone missing. Flyers, calls to shelters, searching every alley and street corner. He had feared the worst, but now, seeing Max in pain, his fear turned into something else. Rage. Daniel's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto the officer standing a few feet away. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. The crowd parted slightly, revealing Officer Grant. He stood with his arms crossed, an indifferent expression on his face. "That dog was a nuisance," he said flatly. "Wandering around, bothering people. I was just handling the problem." Daniel's eyes darkened. His hands clenched in a fist at his sides as he slowly rose to his feet. Though he wore a simple leather jacket and jeans, there was something imposing about him, something controlled yet threatening. His military training had taught him discipline, but right now, every fiber of his being burned with the need to act. "You sprayed him?" Daniel's voice was sharp, laced with disbelief. Officer Grant lifted a shoulder in a shrug. "It's not illegal." Daniel took a step forward. "It's inhumane." His tone was razor-sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. The people around them murmured in agreement, shifting uneasily. A woman in the crowd crossed her arms. "I saw everything. The dog wasn't attacking anyone. He was just looking for food." "Yeah," a man chimed in. "You didn't have to do that." Others began voicing their disapproval, the marketplace now filled with the hum of discontent. A teenager held up his phone, the screen still recording. "This is already online," he muttered. "People are not going to like this." Officer Grant's expression faltered for the first time. His gaze darted around, realizing just how many people were watching. The authority he had relied on to silence stray dogs didn't seem to work as well on an angry crowd. Daniel took another step forward, his voice a deadly calm. "You attacked my dog, a defenseless animal, and you think you're just going to walk away from this?" The officer swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were judging. And Officer Grant was starting to realize he had made a very public mistake. The tension in the air was suffocating. Officer Grant's chest rose and fell quickly, his confidence crumbling as he faced not just Daniel's fury, but the overwhelming disgust of the crowd. This wasn't just an overreaction anymore. It wasn't just about a stray dog. It was about him, about the kind of man he had revealed himself to be. Daniel slowly rose to his feet, his eyes locked onto the officer with a cold intensity. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The quiet, seething rage in his expression was far more terrifying than any shouted words. You saw a hungry dog and thought he was a problem, but you didn't stop to think about who he was, what he's been through. His jaw clenched as he took a step closer, towering over Grant. You didn't even hesitate, did you? Just reached for the spray and pulled the trigger. Like he was nothing. The officer opened his mouth, scrambling for an excuse. I didn't know he was..." Daniel's voice cut through his stammering. "You didn't care?" The words hit like a punch to the gut. Officer Grant flinched, shame flickering across his face. He took another step back, as if trying to put space between himself and the weight of what he had done. Max let out a weak, shuddering breath, his nose still burning, his body still trembling. The sound sent another wave of outrage rippling through the crowd. A young man with his phone, held high, shook his head. "This is already blowing up online." He glanced at Grant, his lips curling in disgust. "Good luck keeping your job, man." A middle-aged woman scoffed. "You should be ashamed of yourself." A vendor, one of the same men who had earlier shooed Max away, looked at the officer with narrowed eyes. "If that dog was good enough to fight for this country, he's damn well good enough to be here." Others murmured in agreement. The tide had turned completely. The officer's face was pale now, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The weight of the cameras, the voices, the anger pressing in from all sides. It was suffocating. Daniel shook his head. "You think being a cop gives you power? That badge isn't supposed to be a weapon for hurting the defenseless. It's supposed to mean something." He stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "Right now it means nothing." For the first time, Officer Grant had nothing to say. No quick retort, no indignant defense. Just silence. Then a sudden movement. Max, still weak, still recovering, shifted against Daniel's leg. His body trembled, but his tail, just barely, gave a small, hesitant wag. Even after everything, even through the pain, he found comfort in his person. Daniel swallowed hard, his anger momentarily overshadowed by something deeper, relief. He knelt again, placing a hand gently on Max's head. "You're gonna be okay, buddy. I've got you." His voice was softer now, filled with the kind of tenderness that only comes from true loyalty. The crowd, still buzzing with fury, now watched in solemn silence as Daniel carefully scooped Max into his arms. The once proud soldier, the war hero who had once saved lives on the battlefield, now lay exhausted in the embrace of the man he had once protected. Daniel turned without another glance at the officer, his focus solely on the dog who had never once let him down. The crowd parted as he walked through, some murmuring words of support, others casting one final glare at the disgraced cop. Officer Grant stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and as Daniel disappeared from view, carrying his wounded friend to safety, Grant knew one thing for certain. He would regret this moment for the rest of his life. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer Grant like an unbearable burden. His throat was dry, his heart pounding against his ribs. The murmurs of the crowd still swirled around him, some filled with outrage, others with disbelief. His mind raced, searching for a way to undo the damage, but the truth was clear. He couldn't. Still, he had to try. He started, his voice unsteady. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I was wrong." His gaze flickered between Daniel and Max, the heroic dog still trembling in his owner's arms. "I shouldn't have done that. I should have stopped to think before I reacted like that." Daniel's jaw tightened, his grip on Max shifting slightly. He met Grant's eyes with a hard, unreadable stare. The anger that had been so sharp moments ago was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now there was something else, too, a cold detachment. Grant took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time, his voice raw with regret. "I didn't know, but that's not an excuse. What I did was cruel. I deserve whatever comes next." Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence was heavier than any words could have been. Then, unexpectedly, a small voice broke through the tense stillness. "That dog saved me." All eyes turned toward the speaker, a young boy, no older than 10, stepping hesitantly out from the crowd. His dark eyes flickered nervously between the faces around him, but his gaze settled on Max, softening with gratitude. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, but he said nothing, waiting. The boy took a deep breath before continuing. "It was last year," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I was playing near the park, and some big dog came out of nowhere. I think it was mean or scared, but it tried to bite me. I didn't know what to do. I fell, and I thought—" He hesitated, his hands clenching in his small fists. "I thought it was going to hurt me bad." A woman, presumably his mother, reached out to rest a hand on his shoulder, but the boy didn't stop. "Then this dog, Max, he came running out from the street. I don't know how he knew, but he just jumped between me and the other dog. He barked and growled and didn't let it get near me. He protected me until some people came and scared the dog away." The boy looked up at Daniel now, his voice full of sincerity. "If it wasn't for him, I would have been hurt. Maybe worse." His gaze shifted to Officer Grant, his small face filled with something between disappointment and quiet wisdom beyond his years. "You hurt a hero." The crowd murmured again, this time with a different kind of energy. Some people nodded. Others cast even darker looks at Grant. The officer himself felt something inside him break further. The shame was unbearable now, wrapping around him like chains he couldn't escape. He let out a slow, unsteady breath. "I get it," he murmured. "I don't deserve to wear this badge." His fingers reached up to touch it, as if it suddenly felt heavier. "If losing my job is what it takes to make this right, then," he exhaled sharply, nodding to himself. "Then so be it." Daniel's eyes remained locked on him, unreadable. The crowd waited. A long, tense silence stretched between the two men. Then Daniel finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, but no less powerful. "Firing you won't fix what happened." He shifted Max gently in his arms, his gaze softening just slightly as he stroked the dog's fur. "It won't take back the pain you caused." Grant swallowed, nodding slowly. "I know. But," Daniel continued, his voice firm, "what you do from this moment forward might." Grant blinked, startled. "What?" Daniel tilted his head, studying the man before him. "You say you want to take responsibility?" Grant straightened. "I do." Daniel's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Then prove it." The officer's breath hitched. "How?" Daniel took a long moment before answering. "You spend your time protecting this town, right?" Grant hesitated, then nodded. "Then start by protecting the ones who can't speak for themselves," Daniel said. "Learn what it really means to serve. The homeless, the forgotten, the ones you would have ignored before. And animals like Max, the ones people look at and see as nothing." His eyes darkened slightly. "You saw Max and thought he was just a nuisance. You didn't ask questions. You didn't stop to think. Change that." Grant exhaled slowly. The idea settled deep within him. Uncomfortable, but undeniably right. He had spent years upholding the law, but he had never truly thought about the ones who slipped through the cracks. Maybe that was part of the problem. He squared his shoulders, nodding firmly. "I will." Daniel's expression remained unreadable for another long moment. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on the crowd. A woman wiped at her eyes. The young boy, still standing nearby, gave Max a small smile. Daniel sighed, looking down at Max. The dog, though still weak, had relaxed slightly in his arms, as if sensing that the storm had passed. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked away, cradling his loyal companion. And as Officer Grant watched him go, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else, something harder, something necessary. And for the first time in a long while, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The next few days brought a shift that no one in the town could have predicted. True to his word, Officer Grant took full responsibility for his actions. Not just with words, but with actions that spoke louder than any apology ever could. The very next morning, Grant drove Daniel and Max to the nearest veterinary clinic, making sure the dog received the best care possible. The veterinarian, a kind woman with years of experience, examined Max thoroughly, checking his eyes, nose, and breathing. The irritation should subside in a couple of days, she assured them, gently stroking Max's head. "He's strong. With proper rest, he'll recover fully." Daniel, still protective, stayed by Max's side the entire time. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Grant hadn't left either. The officer stood quietly in the corner, watching with an expression that was different now. Concerned, remorseful, maybe even hopeful. When it was time to pay, Grant stepped forward without hesitation, handing over his credit card before Daniel could object. "This is on me," he said firmly. "It's the least I can do." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. He didn't say thank you. Not yet, but something in his gaze softened, just slightly. After leaving the clinic, Grant didn't stop there. That very afternoon, he walked into the town's small animal shelter, a place he had barely given a second thought to before. Now, he looked around, seeing the desperate, hopeful eyes of the dogs and cats waiting for someone to care. The shelter's manager, an elderly woman named Martha, was surprised when the officer approached her. "How can I help you, officer?" she asked warily, having already heard what had happened in the marketplace. Grant exhaled deeply. "I want to make things right." He reached into his pocket and placed an envelope on the counter, his personal donation, a substantial one. "For the animals?" Martha's eyes widened as she opened it, but before she could speak, Grant continued, his voice quieter now. "And I want to volunteer, however I can." Martha studied him for a long moment before nodding, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Well, we could always use more hands, especially someone in uniform." For the first time in days, Grant felt something lighten inside him. Word of his actions spread quickly through the town. The same people who had once looked at him with disgust now watched with curiosity, some even with approval. But the real moment of change came when the town decided to do something even greater. A few days later, under the golden glow of the setting sun, the town gathered in the main square for a small, yet deeply meaningful event, an official ceremony to honor Max. People brought flowers, treats, and handmade signs that read "Thank you, Max," and a true hero. Children who had once played near Max, not realizing the depth of his past, now looked at him with admiration. Daniel stood proudly beside his dog, his hand resting gently on Max's back. The once weary animal, now fully recovered, sat tall, his ears perked up as if he somehow understood the momentous occasion. And when the mayor stepped forward to present Max with an honorary medal, a small token of the town's gratitude, Daniel couldn't help but smile as Max wagged his tail for the first time since that awful day. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. As the ceremony came to a close, Grant hesitated before stepping forward. The crowd watched as he approached Daniel and Max, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. But this time, there was no hostility, only quiet anticipation. Grant knelt down, hesitating for only a moment before reaching out. Max, once wary of the officer, now sniffed at his hand before allowing him to gently scratch behind his ear. A quiet moment passed between them, a moment of understanding, of redemption. Daniel watched the exchange, his arms crossed. Then, after a long silence, he nodded. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic forgiveness, but something real. Acknowledgement. The crowd watched, and then, as if signaling the end of a story and the beginning of another, a ripple of soft applause spread through them. Officer Grant had changed, and Max, ever the loyal hero, had helped change him. The air smelled of wood smoke and something earthy, fresh bread, perhaps, or the comforting scent of dried herbs hanging in the rafters. Ethan had built this place with his own hands, each beam, each nail a testament to the quiet strength that defined him. It was a modest home, but to Max, it felt like a palace. Max's puppies were curled up on a thick blanket near the fire, their tiny bodies rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. The warmth of the cabin seemed to seep into their fragile bones, filling them with peace after the terror they had just endured. They were alive. They were safe. Max's legs ached from the strain of the day's ordeal, his body heavy with exhaustion. He limped toward the fire, his movements slow and weary, before lying down beside the puppies. His body sank into the soft blanket beneath him, his limbs aching, but it was a good ache, a reminder that he had survived. Ethan sat nearby, leaning against the wall, watching them quietly. His eyes were soft, thoughtful, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was something gentle about his gaze, something that spoke of a life lived in solitude but also in understanding. He didn't speak much, but his presence was constant, grounding, like the fire that crackled in the hearth, steady and unwavering. "You're stronger than you look," Ethan said softly, his voice low and rough with the weight of unspoken things. He glanced at Max, then at the puppies. His smile deepened, just a little, as if he found something in their shared silence that made this moment worth more than words could express. Max's tired eyes flickered, then sank closed. His head, once so alert and fearful, finally found its place on Ethan's knee. The warmth of Ethan's touch seeped into him, a quiet comfort that Max hadn't known he needed until now. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, its warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, it felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath for just a little longer. No more howling blizzards. No more cruel hands reaching for him, for his pups. No more running, no more hiding. Just warmth. Just safety. Max's heart slowed, the beat steady and calm, in tune with the flickering flames. For the first time in what felt like forever, his body relaxed completely. The ache in his bones softened, the tension in his muscles eased, and the fear that had once gripped him so tightly began to melt away like ice in the sun. He didn't need to be alert anymore. He didn't need to worry. For the first time in a long time, Max closed his eyes and allowed himself to sleep.